All right, so this is Todd Atkins, and I'm here with James Werme, who was in the kind of in a, I would say, a backstage, or even you were in a not just backstage, but in a appearance role with the UFC. And I kind of wanted, before we start, I have a sponsor here, Live to Fight Design. They make fight banners and gym banners for anybody that's checking out. If you use my name, Todd Atkins, you can get $20 off a banner for your gym or for a fighter. Now, James, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself. As we were talking offline, there's a whole new world of fans who don't know some of the people that were there in the early days. So I want to give you a chance to kind of tell people.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm pleased to be here, Todd. My name is James Werme, and I worked for Semaphore Entertainment Group, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, from 1995 to 2001. I served as executive producer, vice president of production. I was also on-air talent on the broadcast team.
So now that you mentioned that, so that's probably what took you into it. You were already with SEG at the time.
Well, let me recap as quickly as I can, just so everyone has an idea. I started off my professional career after I graduated. I born and raised in Worcester, Massachusetts. Went to Boston College, graduated in 1994. Coming out of school, I was interested in getting into live event marketing and promotion. I wound up getting a job at the local arena in Worcester, which was at that time called the Worcester Centrum, 13,000-seat arena, arena football, minor league hockey, concerts, events of all kinds. Worked there for a while, and then through a contact there, got an interview and subsequently got a position at the WWF, now the WWE. So worked down in Stamford at the Titan Tower for, I don't know, 7 or 8 months, doing all sorts of great, interesting, crazy stuff in the live event marketing department. And then the WWF went through a round of layoffs in the summer of '95, and I got the axe along with many others. Moved down to New York, had a couple of buddies from school that had an open available sofa. Decided I wanted to head towards New York City and started interviewing for positions down there. Wound up at Semaphore Entertainment Group. Interviewed with David Isaacs for a position that they had open, and that's how I got the job at SEG. As David explained during the interview, they were looking for someone to handle a lot of the loose ends. They were a very small team. They liked the idea of the WWF background, especially live events, things of that nature, sports entertainment. So at the beginning, my responsibilities involved helping David clean up all the stuff that was on his desk. We had a 900 number at that time that needed to be written and recorded. We were dealing with a lot of home video licensees, television licensees, international stuff, all sorts of loose ends, which then led to handling the live event. After the promoter we had a falling out, so I took that responsibility on. A couple of years later, we changed the production process in the office. I started to take over the TV stuff. A couple of years later, I was on air. So, between '95 and 2001, I went from, low guy on the totem pole to executive producer and basically running the show day to day.
Now, tell me a little bit about what it was like in Titan. Maybe talk, some people might find that to be, WWF, Titan Tower. What was that like?
It was super cool. I mean, for a guy from Worcester, I grew up watching the WWF every Saturday. I was probably 12, 13 years old at the height of Hulkamania. I used to go to the matches when they came to town. I used to, like I said, watch it every week. And now suddenly I'm working there. I've got a parking space. I'm on the 4th floor of the tower, which is where Vince's office was. It was pretty awesome for a young kid being thrown into that type of machine. with regard to live events and house shows and pay-per-views and TV tapings. And it was really exciting, obviously very interesting. I was in the office every day, but I also was lucky enough to go on some TV tapings. I worked WrestleMania 12, King of the Ring that year. You know, I always said yes to everything, anything. And it was a very interesting and enjoyable time. A lot of good memories from that time. And just to let your listeners know, this is when Diesel was champ. Diesel, Shawn, Brett, Razor, you know, those were the top guys. Yoko, Owen. You know, I'm sure I'm forgetting some people, but yeah, I mean, I could tell you about you know, the feeling backstage at WrestleMania, which was absolutely incredible. That was the year Bam Bam wrestled LT, Lawrence Taylor. So that was a big deal. And I remember one time carpooling with the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, because he didn't feel like renting his own car. So he hopped in with a couple of the office guys. But yeah, it was wild stuff like that, living in a cartoon world, but yet very corporate. Titan Tower is an office building, and I worked on the 4th floor, and that's probably the only job I've ever had where I wore a tie and a jacket. And it was really, really something for a 23-year-old, you know, kid looking to get into live event television. To be front row at the WWE, WWF at that time was, you know, absolutely incredible.
Funny how the $1 Million Man didn't want to rent his own vehicle.
Yeah, and he spent the whole time explaining to me that he wanted to put a pool in at his house in the shape of a $sign so that it could be a tax write-off. And he was going to try to convince Vince to shoot some vignettes there. Really interesting ride with Ted. We did the Northeast TV tapings. I think we were in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Danville, PA. But yeah, it was like that. You know, crazy stuff like that happened all the time. And backstage was wild, and the shows were great, and the office was cool, and yeah, it was the corporate side of a cartoon world is the, I guess, the best way for me to describe it. But for a kid from Worcester who grew up a couple hours away from Stamford, you know, WWF is the brand in the area. This is still, you know, the territory is leaning into the nationwide takeover. But yeah, it was awesome. It was really awesome.
Do you ever have to interact with Vince or anything like that?
I spoke to Vince McMahon twice. I mean, I used to see him around all the time because we were on the same floor, and obviously he's at the TV tapings and at the pay-per-views. But, you know, given the position I would never approach Vince. But there was one occasion early on in my employment where the Titan Tower has this sick gym, and I was in there, you know, going to work out, and I come out of the locker room, and who's sitting on an exercise bike? The place is empty, but who's sitting in an exercise bike with Vince McMahon reading a magazine? So, you know, I've been there a couple weeks. There's no way I'm passing up this opportunity. I go sit on the bike next to him, start pedaling, introduce myself, you know, tell him, hey, just started. I'm on the 4th floor in the marketing department. You know, real happy to be here, real pleased to be here. You know, excited to be a part of the team. And, you know, we had a chit chat, but that was about it. Years later, we had a more involved conversation. We were both backstage. Shane was there as well. I was there with one of the producers for the UFC, and we were at Radio City seeing ZZ Top. And the guy I was with knew the band, and we were all backstage. And Vince and Shane were there, also in the backstage green room. They were there to, I think they were trying to get the rights to one of the ZZ Top songs for a SummerSlam or something that was happening in San Antonio. So, but I remember that was right around the time when we were starting to make some headway in New York State. So I specifically remember speaking to Shane about dates and venues and things like that, and Vince was there. So the only time I ever had, even though I worked at the WWE, the only time I actually had a real conversation with Vince was years later when I was working for the UFC.
So he wasn't the kind of boss who kind of came around a lot on the floors and stuff and interacted with people.
I'm sorry?
He wasn't the kind of boss who kind of interacted with people on a regular
Vince?
basis. Yeah.
No, I mean, at TV tapings were so busy and he's being pulled in every direction. No, he's not out. He's with the talent. He's with the television production. And I wasn't involved in TV. I was there as in a live event capacity at that time. So there would have been really no reason for us to interact. And like I said, I was a young guy. I wasn't about to go start talking to Vince. But that's not to say that he was not, friendly or warm in any way. But the scenes backstage, especially when you're taping TV, very hectic, and you just try to stay out of their way.
So, how do you think that prepared you to go to Semaphore?
Well, I think it was probably the key experience that got me the job with SEG. They didn't really have anyone in the office that was from a live event that had a live event background. The original executives at SEG were from the world of music, comedy, radio. So there wasn't a sports person, there wasn't a sports entertainment person, and there wasn't a live event person there. So I think I filled some holes right off the bat, which was attractive to them and provided a new perspective or a different angle on things that didn't previously exist. So, definitely the live event experience with the WWF coming from a touring show, and obviously this time I spent at the building. I think both of those things added to the value that they thought I could bring to the staff.
So, you were working for David Isaacs at that time, or?
I was immediately under David, worked with him on a lot of the projects. David was basically the chief operating officer at that time. Just to kind of lay out the land, Bob Meyerowitz was the CEO and president. David was the COO. Campbell McLaren was the creative executive, really the guy that started it. Michael Abramson handled the affiliate marketing, and Michael Pilot was the in-house producer. So we were also very top heavy. So we had a lot of generals, and I came in, as a very willing and energetic soldier.
Now, kind of talk me through like your first, talk me through like when the UFC, when you started to get involved with like, involvement with the UFC creatively and whatnot.
Well, I was hired specifically to work on the UFC. And by that time, SEG had pretty much given up on doing other shows. Prior to that, they had done a lot of music and comedy, but the UFC was paying the rent. And so that was really the direction that they were going to go in, full speed ahead. Like I said, right off the bat, I was writing the 900 number, interviewing fighters and doing all that stuff. Home video, licensees, stuff like that. When did I first get involved in the creative aspects of the show? That was probably around 97. I think it was 97 that we changed direction and we replaced our in-house producer with an outside production company that would do the live event production, the truck stuff. But that left a lot of gaps as far as all the pre-production, the commercial, the show opens, all those fighter features, and the post-production, the cut downs, and getting the tapes ready to send out. So it was at that time that I started to do things like that, writing the fighter features, doing the show opens, where I could see my stamp on the show via these video features. And really, that kept happening to me, and I'm very lucky, and I seized every opportunity because those were tough times and ended up being tough times. Every time there was, every time we had a person leave or a budget cut left this open, it went to my desk, which I was happy about and I welcomed. So, like I said, we had a falling out with our local promoter, with our promoter. Hey, I'll do the shows. I'll do the live event marketing, promotion, ticketing, all that stuff, book the building deals. I'm happy to do it. A couple of years later, hey, we're going to get rid of our in-house producer, but we need someone to do all the stuff. I'll do it, and that involved me working all day in the office and then spending the nights in the edit room. And then a couple of years later, when we're doing the Japan shows and we weren't sending the talent to call the show ringside, Bob turns to me and says, I say, we need someone to do the interviews. And he turns to me and says, well, you do it. So every time a budget cut or personnel cut happened, usually those responsibilities fell on me, which I was very lucky for because it allowed me to gain all this responsibility and all this experience and really put my fingerprints on the show. So, I loved it.
Now, so you were there before Dana and Lorenzo came in.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I I started in, let's see, I started in October of 1995. My first show, which was actually the 8th show of the series, my first show was Ultimate 95, which was like the Tournament of Champions end of year show for 1995. So I'm way before Dana and Lorenzo and Frank, the ZUFFA team. Yeah, I'm not there at the beginning, but I'm there. I'm there 8 shows in. So they started in late 93, so I'm there late 95, so I'm 2 years in.
yeah,
And
someone who's been around watching forever, it's you have to kind of rack your brain as when you're looking at who was where, and I watch videos, I'd seen you in, interviewing Dan and stuff, and I'm like, I don't remember how long you've been there.
yeah, my last show was early 2002, so I'm there 95 to 2002, and basically, so the days of Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn, into the days of Tito, Frank, into the days of ZUFFA and let's see, BJ, and of course Fry and Coleman, Hughes, Militich, Kerr, Couture, of course, Randy, Pedro, Hizzo, Josh Barnett. Yeah, I mean, Carlos Newton, Dan Henderson, Matt Hughes, Dennis Hallman, Jens Pulver. So yeah, I mean, the mid late 90s, early 2000s was my run.
Take me through like when SEG was having problems, kind of leading up to when Zuffa takes it over. Kind of tell me what that was like, because you were working for Semaphore. Kind of
Yeah.
tell me what that was like.
Yeah, so I have to start with the political and legal issues that put us in a bad space. That's kind of the lead in. We were ending up in court everywhere we went. We were spending too much money on legal bills. Politicians were lobbying against us. Cable systems were shutting us down. So our streams of revenue were sometimes being cut off completely, and a lot of times being just constrained. I think at that time the pay-per-view universe was 35 million homes, and we were seeing a small fraction of that. The only full coverage we had was DirecTV and Dish, which represented, maybe at that time it was 10 or 12 million, but we weren't playing to the potential audience that we could have been. And we decided to combat that through sanctioning. We tried to put together a good package to present to athletic commissions so that we would be sanctioned and recognized. And it seemed like every time there was success, something would happen. And that's really the story of my time, which is referred to as the dark days. Dark because we were getting shut off everywhere. The thing about the dark days, and the thing about the UFC in those times, was that the line between mainstream success and absolute failure was very thin. And there were days, on a Monday, we'd get some news and it would feel like, okay, we're going to break through, because we all knew the potential of the show. We all knew that this was something that was special and could be huge, and that's why we all worked so hard at it. But then on Tuesday, we get a call from the lobbyist here, or the lawyer there, or the athletic commission there, and suddenly hopes are dashed. So it was a very frustrating time, and Bob was putting in a lot of his own money, and we weren't seeing the types of returns. We had also lost our most lucrative home video deal through Trimark, the Blockbuster deal. So things weren't headed in the right direction. And at the same time, Bob had started up a .com startup at that time. So his attentions were elsewhere. And I think he was just looking to get out. And I frankly don't blame him, because I know how difficult it was. I know how costly it was. And every show could have been the last for a few years there in the late 90s. So that was the vibe. The vibe was survival. The vibe was, there was maybe three of us in the office doing everything. So it was tough. It was really tough. And Dana at that time was managing Chuck and Tito. So he was having plenty of conversations with myself and with Bob, and he could sense the frustration. He could sense the climate. And this, I just want to back up for a second. I do want to mention that SEG is the ones that opened up New Jersey. So the first one or two New Jersey shows were done under SEG through the efforts of SEG. So, again, that's a perfect example of, we're on the chopping block, running out of cash, can barely keep the show together, but we just opened up Atlantic City, maybe the second largest, boxing gambling venue in the country. So that's how it was. And we had to look for deals that would accommodate that situation. For instance, we did 4 shows in Japan over that time. And the reason we did that for the most part, and the one Brazil show we did in Sao Paulo, the reason we did that is because we were able to have our partners shoulder most of the financial burden. So those were cheap shows for us. So that also kept us alive. But back to ZUFFA, so Dana could smell that things were not going well, and they took a chance. And the guy that had voted against it 2 years before, when he sat on the Nevada State Athletic Commission, was now one of the people buying it. Right. So in the ultimate of ironies, Lorenzo was part of the buying team, and Dana, of course, and Frank Fertitta.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, because it's something that I think has been whitewashed a little bit. Lorenzo's involvement in kind of, voting against it, and then all of a sudden buying the UFC. This is something that a lot of people don't know about.
Yeah, and on paper, it could seem fishy, but as someone that was in the room, I can tell you it was not. What happened between the time that Lorenzo voted against it and the time that Lorenzo bought it was a lot of exposure to the show, a lot of experience, training with guys. So he was a different person, had a different perspective on the UFC, on mixed martial arts, when he purchased it. At the time, he came out, so we were doing a show in Iowa, and we invited a few of the Nevada athletic commissioners out. Lorenzo was one of them, to sit down and watch a show, observe a show from ringside. Everything went great. There was one match, I think it was Jeremy Horn versus Takase, that the referee probably let it go a couple strikes too long, and that left a bad taste in all of their mouths, and it wasn't just Lorenzo. So that kind of left a bad taste. And as I recall, it was, the opponent was down, and Jeremy was kind of leaning in with some good forearms, some good elbows to a downed opponent. So it didn't sit well with someone that was of a boxing perspective at that time. Now, I fast forward to Lorenzo's friend Dana is now managing fighters from this show. They're taking private lessons. They're learning jiu-jitsu. They're becoming more exposed to the show, understanding, how it works and what to look for, and how safe it is in many ways compared to boxing, frankly. And so I think his mind was changed, which is a good thing. There was a lot of people that have done the 180. I could name several who came out against us in the 90s, and then by the 2000s, they're singing our praises and our biggest fans. So in the press, you see that, in the regulation standpoint, from a commission standpoint, and the owners. So like I said, on paper, it may look odd, and it's certainly ironic, but I do not think that there's any fishiness or foul play there. I can tell you that Lorenzo and Frank were huge fans of the show. They trained with the guys. They took private lessons. You know, John Lewis is a guy that really educated them on what's happening, and they embraced it. They loved it. And Dana came to them with a good proposal, a logical proposal. They made a good offer to Bob, and that was it. So I hold no grudges.
Now, you know, obviously Dan Lambert was also thinking about purchasing it. How much did you know about that?
So he was with John Peretti, right?
Right.
Okay. So at that time, I was in very close communications with John, and John would tell me every day we would speak, and he'd say, "We're going to buy this. We're going to do this. We're going," and then he was making plans, and he was ready to make it happen. And I think that Bob perhaps misled them to a certain extent. But I can tell you that at the same time that John Peretti was telling me we're going to buy it, it's a done deal, Bob Myrowitz was telling me that there's no way I'll ever sell this show to John Peretti.
Why was that, you think?
You'd have to ask Bob that, but I think it would go back to the Battlecade Extreme days. And even though we worked very closely with John, and John was a valued part of the team and did a great job, there was always a bad blood and tension, bad blood and tension left over from the Extreme days, because we didn't feel like they always conducted themselves in the best way.
So Dana and Lorenzo and them come in. Kind of tell me what changed.
Well, the location of the office changed. The budgets changed. The attitude changed. The name changed. You know, everything changed, except, you know, what the show was. You know, the octagon remained. The format pretty much remained the same. But, you know, they came in with a real fresh attitude, willingness to spend money on things, willingness to upgrade the fighter pay, the production value, the development of the talent, the promotion, advertising, publicity, everything. You know, they had deep pockets and they had a great attitude, and they were very excited to turn it around. And these are really successful guys who believed that they could turn it around. So yeah, the office moved from New York out to Vegas a couple months later. You know, suddenly they were sending me all over the world to do up close training camp, you know, fighter videos and vignettes and interviews, which was great. We did a huge advertising campaign with Carmen Electra, a bunch of other supermodels that was in Rolling Stone and Maxim and all the men's magazines at the time. Bigger shows. We did the Meadowlands. You know, we did the Taj a few more times, and then we moved to the Meadowlands, which was fantastic. You know, they put a fresh coat of paint on everything. Rebranded, I guess would be the word, and used their contacts to push through the things that SEG would never have been able to. So, you know, in many ways, it needed to happen in order to certainly get Nevada. You know, who's to say that SEG would never have gotten Nevada, but having the owner be a former state athletic commissioner certainly helped. Putting a fresh coat of paint on it certainly helped. Being able to go to politicians and cable executives and say, hey, the old management is gone. This is a new, you know, there's new sheriffs in town. We're going to do A, B, C, D, even though it was the same show. There were no different rules. You know, my boss, Bob, had maybe rubbed some of the industry people the wrong way, because, you know, when we would get hit, sometime we would react softly, sometime we would react loudly. And I can't fault him for either reaction, because we were fighting for our lives in many cases. So
Now, kind of tell me some of the early ZUFFA points where you're working for them, because I don't want to have, you know, go through everything. That's just too long. But maybe just some of the early things that you remember.
The early things like what? Like what?
I don't know, just because we're kind of talking about your time there working. I'm not specifically talking about fights necessarily, because we're
Hmm.
talking about you. So
Hmm.
maybe just some of the early things that your career wise, from the experience that, just come right to the top of your memory.
Well, the thing that happened when ZUFFA took over is I kind of got demoted in some ways because Dana was now running the show, and I was the vice president of production, and they wanted me to just focus on the show. They took me off air, so I was no longer doing the interviews. So in that sense, my influence on the show diminished, my presence on the show diminished. Um, I didn't have as much influence as I had in the previous years, and Dana was running the show. Joe Silva was very involved, very influential in the office. Lorenzo and Frank were around, but weren't around really on a day-to-day basis. So, that was in some ways difficult to adjust to. Um, there were differences of opinion with regard to priorities and budgets. These guys were not fight promoters. They were not television producers. They were fans when they bought the show. And I don't mean to say that in a derogatory sense, but there is a learning curve. And, like I said, incredible businessman, incredibly successful. But this is quite a different animal. And I think they would agree, and they would say the same thing. So, there was a learning curve that they had to go through, that maybe I could have been more patient with or less vocal about. So, hindsight is 2020, especially 20 years later. But yeah, everything changed. Everything changed.
When did they take off the interviews? Because I was looking at like videos from UFC 32. You were still on the microphone at that time. When did that happen?
Yeah, I think my last show was 32, which was the Meadowlands, which was maybe summer of 2001, 2000, something like that. Yeah, Dana had a buddy. There was a guy, well, Ryan Bennett was his name,
Mhm.
and he had done some favorable pieces with Chuck. He was from Northern California, San Luis Obispo, and he had done some stuff with Chuck. And I think that was kind of Dana's payback for that. But Ryan was great, and he came in, and that was fine. That wasn't my main gig, and I certainly wasn't a professional on-air broadcaster. Like I said earlier, that was a budget cut, and Bob turned to me and said, "You do it. I don't want to pay to send someone over there just to do interviews. You're going to be there. You can do it." So okay, I'll do it, and it was great fun because I knew those guys, and I enjoyed being on air and talking to them and talking them up and hyping the show. And remember, by that time, I was doing all the press, any type of interviews and stuff, so I could talk the talk and stress the points that we wanted to get across about the sport and about the fighters. So I felt comfortable in that role, and I enjoyed that role. And I was disappointed when they took me off, but I certainly understood they were the new bosses. They could do whatever they wanted.
Now tell me about Joe Silva, because I think he's another guy. I mean, I would say kind of the newer wave of fans maybe don't know who he is exactly. And also, he's kind of fallen off the face of the earth since he left the UFC. He's
That's
gone.
what we do, man. When we
He's gone
leave,
radio silent.
we're, we're so burnt that we just want to get away, and I understand that. Joe, so I tell you my experiences with Joe. First of all, let me just say that Joe is a very important person to SEG and the UFC and ZUFFA and the show as a whole, and mixed martial arts as a whole. Joe had an active role in developing the unified rules of mixed martial arts. He worked with our talent. He worked with the fighters. He was a valued consultant to the fighters and to management. So Joe's importance, whether you agree or not with the way he matched fighters, that's a matter of opinion. But as far as a person and a personality within the show that worked towards making this as great and as big as it could be. Joe should get a lot of credit. So my experience with Joe, early on, Campbell McLaren called me into his office and handed me an empty manila office folder with one yellow sticky on it, and it said super fan Joe Silva, and it had his phone number. And Campbell said, this is Joe Silva's number. He is our super fan. I try to talk to him, once or twice a month, just to hear what he thinks, and get his opinions on what's happening with the show. It's good to get feedback from someone that's really into the show. So, can you take on that for me and just, check in with him every once in a while, see what he has to say. Okay, fine, no problem. Anything else I need to know about this guy? He said, well, yeah, he's going to spend most of the time telling you how much the show sucks and what a bad job we're doing. So that's what Joe was when I was first introduced to him, was an unpaid consultant, if you will, super fan, someone that we spoke to get feedback about the show and fighters and what we did well and what we did bad and how we can improve and things like that. Eventually, a few of us in the office recognized Joe's passion and performance, and we gave him more stuff to do, and he started to do some of the pre-fight interview stuff, the phone stuff we did with the fighters before the event, just to get name, height, hometown, how do you want to be introduced, talk about your record, notes for our broadcasters and everyone in the office, so we would know who these guys were. And as a result, Joe started to develop relationships with a lot of fighters as well. And so, that continues. Joe would come to the shows. We would fly him in, but that was kind of the only compensation that Joe received. Now, that said, there were many times in the office in the late 90s where Bob would have some sort of disagreement with John Peretti. And, for a few hours during the day, it would be like, Joe Silva's going to be the new matchmaker. I'm sick of Peretti. I'm just going to hire Joe. But it would never happen. But Joe was always in that conversation. So even though he was outside, he was still very much inside. He was never a part of the staff, but he was, part of the team. And then when the ZUFFA boys came in, I don't think that they really had I don't think they had a serious intention to hire John. John did a great job, and John was certainly knowledgeable of the fights and the fighters, but John is a kind of a polarizing type of personality, can be abrasive at times. We always get along great, but plenty of people do not. So Joe Silva had established a really good relationship with Tito, and actually had helped us convince Tito to take a few fights that he maybe didn't want to take on his way up. And I think when they were talking about matchmaking, Tito said, hey, you got to meet this guy, Joe Silva. He knows everything about everybody, and he watches all these tapes, and he's got VHSs from Thailand and Japan and everywhere. And Dana and Joe must have hit it off, because when I arrived to my office in Las Vegas, Joe had an office right next to me, and he was the matchmaker. So it was through, I think, his relationship with Tito. Obviously, listen, you talk to Joe for 5 minutes and you realize that he is deeply entrenched in the world of mixed martial arts, and has been, since, the early 90s. But that's my experience with Joe. Joe can also be difficult, but very knowledgeable, very helpful, a valued consultant during my time.
Why do you think he fell off the face of the earth like he did, though? He's like even more than you. Like, no one knows. I know he gave some testimony for this antitrust suit, but other than that, like,
he's probably forced to do that.
He's like Sasquatch. No one, or the abominable snowman. He's like one of these mythical people now. You can't find him or see him.
Well, I can speak for myself, and I can hypothesize about Joe, but I can tell you that the UFC is a grind, and is blood, sweat, and tears. And by the time I left or was dismissed, I didn't want anything to do with it. And I was happy to not be around it or talk about it or relive it. It's just kind of, it works you to the bone, and you just got to get away. And I'm not saying that's what happened to Joe, but that's kind of what happened to me. So who knows? You know, he had a great run. He put in his time, and you pass the baton, and that's how I see myself, as you know, part of the relay team. You know, I had my years, and I did the best I could, and was true to the show, and then I passed the baton to Dana and the ZUFFA boys, and they've done, you know, an incredible job and taken it to the heights that we all knew it could, and even beyond. You know, incredible success, and I'm nothing but proud of what they've accomplished.
Let's talk a little bit more about Peretti, because I think, you know, we should touch on him a little bit more, because a lot of people don't know about Peretti, but he had a big impact on MMA, not just with the UFC, but his battle kid, like you were talking about. So maybe talk
John,
a little bit more about John.
of course, I'd love to, and he deserves it. John is a founder of American mixed martial arts,
Yeah.
and a founder of American mixed martial arts on television, on pay-per-view. John was the co-creator and matchmaker for a show called Battlecade Extreme Fighting, which was the UFC's primary competition in the early 90s. It was bankrolled by Hustler magazine, Bob Guccione, and they were smaller from a production standpoint, from a venue standpoint, from a distribution and popularity standpoint, but their fights were always excellent. And the credit of that goes to John Peretti. John had been a kickboxer, boxer, mixed martial artist, grappler, jiu-jitsu. John was a real Renaissance man when it came to combat sports, and very knowledgeable, very experienced, very plugged into that world. He trained under Gene LeBell, of course, legend, judo Gene. And you know, he was in those worlds. In the 80s, he was in the bodybuilding worlds, and in the 90s, he got into putting mixed martial arts on TV. So, you know, John was a extremely important person in the development of mixed martial arts in the early days. When Battlecade, when Extreme folded, we hired John immediately to be our matchmaker, because we always felt like the fights were good, and the fighters were well credentialed and had excellent pedigree. And you know, Extreme had Olympians fighting on their show, and they had legends from Japan and Brazil, and we were more spectacle. UFC was more spectacle to Extreme's more sport. And we didn't like those guys because we felt like they made bad business decisions that hurt the overall climate for the event on pay-per-view and as a live event. But when John became available, we hired him to be our matchmaker, and he did an excellent job. I could always count on John to bring in quality guys, dependable guys from good camps on budget. And from a matchmaker, you can't ask for anything more than that. And again, like, those were the dark days, and we didn't have a lot of budgets to play with, but you know, some incredible fights, some awesome fights from those days that were put together by John Peretti. You know, me and John would handle the undercard. I would oversee and work with John on the undercard, and Bob would basically handle the main event. You know, the main event guys were the only ones making any real money, so Bob would handle them personally.
Now tell me about like those business decisions. Maybe talk a little bit more about that from a pay-per-view standpoint.
Well, Extreme tried to live up to their name and push the envelope. And when you're faced with desperate situations, you can react in many different ways. And they, like us, were facing desperate situations. We responded by hiring lobbyists, working on sanctioning, working on convincing cable executives that we were a quality, safe sporting event. That was our direction. Extreme went the other direction, which is we're going to just do it in the back alley, in the warehouse, doesn't matter. We're going to try to pull off a show. We can do this, we can do that, salacious, tabloid style approach. And the final straw was when they screwed up New York, basically, for everyone. We had lobbied the state of New York heavily for years to do shows to get the event sanctioned within the state of New York. And we were ultimately successful in that. And between the time that the Athletic Commission votes to sanction and the time that it becomes official, there's a 3-month grace period. So we had scheduled a show just outside of that 3-month grace period in Niagara Falls. So, we purposefully went upstate so that we weren't too far on the radar, weren't putting in anyone else's faces. We didn't want to become a political football. We had been through that all over the country, and we wanted this to go as smoothly as possible. So they vote, I think the vote was unanimous to sanction the event. Well, Extreme decides to announce a show at the Brooklyn, I think it was the Brooklyn Armory, which, is New York City, is publicity. Suddenly Giuliani's got a mic in front of his face saying, hey, you're going to allow this to happen in your city? Over my dead body, I'm not going to happen. That's not going to happen. And pretty soon Pataki is like, well, I'm not going to allow it in the States. So within a span of 90 days, we go from unanimous approval, sanctioning, to emergency meeting the day before our event to revisit the event and the sanctioning and the approval. And we ended up having to leave in the middle of the night and take the show to Alabama. So they screwed up New York. So that did not certainly leave a good taste in anyone's mouth. And they folded soon thereafter. But they also, they would go on Jerry Springer kind of shows. They were very tabloid. That was their vibe. Even though their fights were excellent and their athletes were excellent, they, as far as marketing and promotion, they took a very tabloid kind of approach, whereas we did not. Even though our show was more spectacle, we always tried to go the route of sanctioning cable executives. Hey, let's, you catch more flies with honey than sugar, or sugar than salt, whatever it is.
Freddie's a sheriff now. Do you know that?
Who is?
Freddie.
Oh, where?
Somewhere in Texas. I think a small area in Texas.
Interesting.
I'll have to look it up for you, but he is. He's a sheriff.
Listen, I consider John a friend. We had a great working relationship. So, his contributions can't be minimalized in the history of mixed martial arts as a sport and a television event. He's up there.
I could imagine getting pulled over by him though.
He give you the look and not say anything.
Yeah. I want to ask you about something that to me was really big on me, and was big at the time for a lot of us that were in, because I was living on Oahu at the time, for the people that were kind of the MMA circle there. And that was kind of like Frank Shamrock and Tito Ortiz. And Frank Shamrock in general is kind of one of the first, for us, maybe in my opinion, like the first greatest fighter we had ever seen. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
I agree 100%. Frank was head and shoulders above the competition. He brought everything to the table. Frank had before Frank entered the UFC, he had an extensive resume of experience in tough fights in pancrase and rings. Frank had been around the block, obviously trained by Ken in the Lion's Den. So Frank was a real guy, and we always knew that. And we tried to get Frank into the show for years, and he didn't want to do it. And finally he agreed to do it. And standing up on the ground, mentality, intellect, conditioning, Frank was the best I ever saw in my time. And he could do it all, and he could do it all with flair, and he understood the show aspect of things, very much a showman, understood the cameras, Uh, Looked great, spoke well, just a great ambassador, a great champion for us at the time. And when you talk about a debut, he comes in and submits Kevin Jackson, Olympic gold medalist, in 20 seconds. And it was right then and there that he stepped out of Ken's shadow, like that. And he went on a run where he was demolishing people. I mean, Igor Zinoviev was never the same. John Lober was never the same. The only one of the toughest fights he had was against Horn, although Frank was a showman as well. But the Frank Tito thing was probably the most exciting fight, certainly the most anticipated, most hyped fight during my tenure, because of the roads that they took towards each other. You had these two guys, both big names, both in the prime of their careers, great subplots and backstories of real animosity, real beef. Tito had beaten a couple of the Lions Den guys. He was disrespectful. Had worn some T-shirts that were very disrespectful. He flipped off Ken. And it was a whole thing. Tito was working the whole bad boy image. Frank had broken away. He was now working out with Maurice Smith and TK, Tsuyoshi Kosaka. They had their own little team, the Alliance. And that was a huge fight that lived up to the hype. So often you get these collision courses and the fight is a dud. But this one was a 4-round war. And, Frank showed who the best in the world was at that time.
Yeah, I think, when there was like only one sports bar that showed the UFC at the time, and like everybody who was kind of in the MMA circles at that time was there. And I remember looking at the reaction, they were all kind of like, wow, like this guy is on another level, man.
Yeah, because also, I talk a lot about Frank, but at that time, Tito was just grounding and pounding people into oblivion, and as what often happens when the big wrestler comes along, it happened with Don Fry, it happened with Mark Coleman, where you watch these guys and they have such size and strength and control ability that you think, man, these guys, they'd be tough to beat. They're never gonna lose, and that's when they lose, of course. That's the thing about the UFC. Just when you think someone can't lose, that's when they will lose. But so you had the immovable force in Tito, the irresistible object in Frank, and I think ultimately, if you watch the fight, it probably came down to conditioning. Now, and I don't know if you know this. I don't know if anyone knows it, but after that fight, Tito and Frank became good friends. And Tito actually went up to train with Frank for a while and really started to prioritize conditioning and the mental aspect of fighting. Frank was very much a scientist in there, and he knew what it took to win on the big stage. And I think Tito learned a lot of that from him and put it to good use. I remember doing an interview with Tito in Huntington Beach, and we talked about how, sometimes you learn more from a loss than you do from a win. And I think that's very often the occasion in athletics.
Now I want to ask you about kind of like your departure from the UFC. When did that come, and what was like the circumstances? What do you remember about it?
What do I remember? Okay, so my last show was, I believe, February or January of 2002, and a few shows before that, the show had run long. I fucked up, and as a result, I was fired. I wasn't fired because the show ran long, but the show running long, I was really never the same after that. Mentally carried a lot of guilt. Probably should have resigned at that time, but stayed on for a few more shows, but wasn't there. And I needed to go. Dana could see that. And on my 30th birthday, February of 2002, I was fired from the UFC.
Explain how a show going long, like what that is for people who don't know.
Sure. When you have a pay-per-view broadcast, you have a window that the show must be within. So, your window is 3 hours. You got to get off the air The show has to be wrapped by 3 hours, or else, the window closes. People at home go to black while the show is still going on. And the show was built heavy. It was our first show back on pay-per-view. There were 3 belts on the line, which is a 5-round fight. So the show was built heavy to start, which, that's the kicker. And that's the thing is where I really made a mistake. And listen, at the end of the day, I rolled the dice in Vegas and I lost. Not the first, and I won't be the last. But it had a profound effect on me, and my attitude towards the show, my ability to stay there and do the show. So the show was built heavy. We were betting on a knockout to pick up some time. We had built in a swing fight, which is when you have your fight order, but if you're running long, you pull one fight out and you put it after the main event, just to make sure that you get that main event on the air. And nobody likes to do that. And I was so focused on giving them a perfect show. And Chuck Liddell was the swing fight. Chuck was one of their boys. And I didn't make the right decision. I decided to roll the dice, betting on a knockout. I figured, yeah, sooner or later we're going to get a knockout. And every fight that night went the distance. So the last 8 minutes of the show were cut off from the viewing audience at home. In addition, it was also so disheartening because the fights were so boring that night that people were leaving early. It was just it was crushing on many levels. And that was kind of when I just broke mentally and wore a lot of guilt. And it eventually that probably manifested itself in me and Dana having a lot of disagreements and some arguments, and me being out of line or just disrespectful to my boss, which is not cool. And I was probably daring him to do it, and he did it.
So, you leave. What was life like after that?
Well, I felt an incredible relief. Yeah, it was one of the. I felt a great sense of relief when it happened. Like I said, I was probably done a couple months before that, and he was doing me a favor by firing me. So I felt a great sense of relief. I went and produced a short film, and I went down to Cancun and I did some beach events for Powerade. I just started a new chapter.
Now, I know you're on Twitter. Are you on there to follow any of like MMA stuff, or what do you do on there exactly? Like,
Yeah, I'm not a huge social media guy. I do have Twitter, and I do follow a lot of the MMA stuff. People, fighters, executives, talk shows, webcasts, things like that, just to kind of stay in the loop. So I wouldn't say I'm a huge fan now, although the kids in the house are, which is fantastic. So I hear about things, and sometimes I see the fights when they get them here, but I try to stay involved on a periphery level. And of course, these days it's impossible to ignore, with ESPN and just the exposure and the constant programming and content that the UFC is creating is really incredible. It's impossible to ignore.
what do you think of the overall landscape, though? Not just the UFC. Are you paying attention like the overall landscape, or just kind of like the UFC?
I'm a company man. I only respect the UFC. No, I'm kidding. I mean, obviously, I know Campbell has his Combate Global thing on Univision, right? Which seems to be doing well, and that's great for him. I'm aware of some of the other organizations, but I certainly don't follow them. I'm a UFC guy. UFC is a top brand. That's like I said, I'm very proud of what they accomplished. I like to think that I played a role in the development of the sport and the show. So I'm UFC true and true.
And what are you doing now?
Right now, I design and manufacture novelty goods. I make Halloween stuff for a retail website called fun.com. They also have other domains called halloweencostume.com and halloween.com. So yeah, something totally different. After my exit from the UFC, I did some freelance television. I worked at the History Channel for a while. I did some ESPN stuff and other, I was in New York and I was working in production, did some music videos and some film work. And then a friend of mine who was in the Halloween business approached me with an idea to start a company, and I just kind of went with that. And that was 15, 20 years ago.
Wow, so you've been doing a long time.
Yeah, yeah, it's my second career.
So like masks and stuff, or is it just
Yeah, when I had a wholesale company, we used to do everything from masks to costumes, to decorations, to inflatables and large animatronics. Nowadays, I focus on more decor, and specifically inflatables, animatronics, things of that nature.
interesting?
But instead of having a wholesale business, I work for one company, one web retailer.
Well, I mean, this interview was fascinating. I feel like I talked to you about different people for a long time, but I don't want to take up all your time.
That's
But
all right. I don't do this very often, so if you have any questions about anyone specifically, I'm happy to answer. And really, it was about the people. And maybe that's one of the things I left out about what changed when ZUFFA took over was the sense of family and everyone working together towards a common goal and teamwork. And not to say it wasn't like that with ZUFFA, it just was different. Um, people like Jeff Blatnick and Mike Goldberg and Elaine McCarthy and John McCarthy and everyone from the office, Paul Romero, Stephen Loeb, the people, Alan Connell, Bruce Connell, people that really, blood, sweat, and tears to get the show on the air at a time when we didn't know the future. We just knew the present. We knew it was important to do the best we could with the limited resources that we had. And like I said, I like to think that I carried the baton, one of the legs of the relay, and certainly passed it off into capable hands with Dana and the Fertitas. So, very proud and very happy of my involvement and the success that the show has achieved.
yeah, it's incredible, to talk to you about all this stuff. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time. These
My
are the
pleasure.
kind of stuff I really love talking about is the history, because this is kind of my era of, when I first started consuming the sport, in the very beginning. So
Yep. No, I mean, the fighters are great. The staff was great. Production people were great. Yeah, it was awesome.
yeah, for everyone who tuned into this, again, this is James Werme, and everyone who supports the show. I want to thank, for checking out these episodes. And until next time, take care.